About it. You're right.
Do you need something?
No, I just need
Something to fidget with, like a
okay.
pen or something. I can't sit still for that long.
Are you a trial attorney?
Yeah,
So you
I have to fidget. I have to have. I'm lost. I knew something was missing. I said I'm supposed to have a pen at all times.
so you're up on your feet in the courtroom?
Yeah.
Do you make points by pointing a pen at somebody?
I try not to. Somebody may bite your finger. I don't think that's a real good strategy.
No.
How would you like somebody coming up to you going?
That's right. I'd grab that sucker
That's
so
right.
fast.
You have the natural instinct to go.
That's right. Shoot. Okay. Basically, what I want to ask you about is the things that you dealt with in your section of the book.
Okay.
If I am correct about it, you pretty much went around and interviewed people who were, I don't want to use the term activists, but people who did things, who attempted to make a difference in Howard County and got their perspectives on what they did, why they did, and the progress that they were able to make.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
That was pretty much your methodology of gathering the information and then pretty much compiling, giving back in book form what they gave to you. Okay. So I'm going to ask, I guess, a combination of just the facts, ma'am, of what you found to be true, but as well, I'm interested in your impressions of it. Now, how long have you lived in Howard County?
76, 86.
Okay.
12 years.
You've been around a while then.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll ask about the facts that you found. I also want to know about your personal impressions as Howard County. Your personal impressions as a black Howard County. And simply value judgments on your part as to what it all means and whatnot, regardless of what the people necessarily told you, just your reflections on it. Okay, so I'm interested in both what they told you and how you feel about it, what you think about it. So let me first start by asking, since your section was about contemporary issues, let me ask you did you find that Howard County's issues, the issues that interested Howard County's black community, were necessarily different from issues that appear to be important to other blacks in Maryland or perhaps other blacks in the United States?
No, they were not different. Blacks here, as around the country, were most interested in quality education, decent housing, affordable housing for low-income persons, political involvement, the ability to make a difference, positions on boards and entities that make a difference. Mainly, Howard Countyans were very focused in on the quality of life because a lot of Howard Countyans came here in anticipation of an improved quality of life. So that is one that was the general focus of many persons I talked to. However, I would feel that's a national thrust and trend. I mean, we're all trying to improve ourselves.
When you asked some of the people that you spoke with what brought you here, what was the range of their answers?
The primary answer I got was for an open, because of the promise of an open community, open in the sense of open to all races, open in terms of new opportunities. Particularly, I remember Fred Weaver, who's a native New Yorker, being attracted to Howard County because it was new, and how he mentioned how in a place like New York City, one is more or less part of a crowd. There are, millions of persons, and how his thought was, well, I'll come to this small community where I can have a greater impact and a say-so from the ground up, be a part of a building process. Many persons spoke about the new town concept and their desire to be a part of something new and unique in terms of openness, remembering that this was in the late 60s and early 70s when the open housing concept had just been announced on the national level. Let's face it, Howard County was, Columbia that is, was one of the first towns to incorporate open housing into its very foundation. In fact, open housing I view as a premise upon which Columbia was built.
So did Mr. Weaver and perhaps others like him, when we say he moved here, are we being specific about Columbia as opposed to Howard County in general?
I believe he was attracted to Columbia because Columbia, of course, was the new town in Howard County. Columbia, Jim Rouse's project was what was being promoted, brochures all about. In fact, many persons were attracted from both the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Areas because of advertising and promotional material they were exposed to. And it was Columbia, I think, more so than the outlying portions of Howard County that brought many blacks here.
What about the rest of Howard County before Columbia? How did it seem in your findings that blacks fared within the context of issues of housing and political and education and employment opportunities? How were blacks faring before Columbia came?
Unfortunately, they were, in essence, nowhere. There were no elected black officials. The schools were barely integrated. The housing conditions were in and about Ellicott City, particularly, were more or less deplorable. Howard County, along comes Columbia and builds a guarantee of everything here is brand new. That sort of guarantee and that sort of promise. Of course, that was a striking contrast to the kinds of conditions that existed in many rural portions of Howard County. Alice Corneliuson, of course, in her portion of the book documents that to a greater extent than I did. However, even in 1969 and 70, you had the Fells Lane controversy with, in essence, open sewage running down the street, and you also had a great need for quality and affordable housing for the lowest, lower income persons in the county. So I would say blacks were not really on board yet when Columbia came into existence.
Yet it seems that when you talked with some blacks who were here before Columbia, that there was some perhaps initial reluctance as to what Columbia was really, quote unquote, going to be about once it was here. What were some of their fears about Columbia coming to Howard County?
Well, I believe any change breeds fear. It's simply a natural reaction. What you've known a long time and become comfortable with is exactly that, comfortable. I believe the fear was based primarily in the fact of newness alone, just the simple fact of new and different and strange. I believe once the project was fully explained by Mr. Rouse and once it was built, attitudes changed and evolved in a positive sense from that point. I mean, once it became aware that Columbia brought increased job opportunities, quality housing of a sort that this county had not seen to that degree, I mean, in sheer numbers before. An opportunity for black political participation because the numbers, I mean, blacks obviously are a very small portion of this community even now, but of course we have multiplied several times over from where we were before Columbia. So of course those changes, the changes brought about by numbers are now perceived as very positive changes, but again, initially I believe it was simply the very point of newness.
So, in general, has Columbia been good? Let's go for a value judgment here. Has Columbia been good for the black community in Howard County?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that Columbia is a nice place to live, for the same reasons Columbia is a nice place to live for its white citizens. Columbia is clean, relatively crime-free, has a quality educational system, doesn't have much in the way of transportation. You have to own a car here, obviously. But on a quality of life scale, Columbia is a nice place to live. The downside of Columbia, in my opinion, for black people, is that Columbia fosters a sense of security in terms of the racial predicament of black people that is dangerous. And I say that particularly for young Colombians. In other words, Columbia is, on its face, innocuous and lends a sense of security to its residents. Black people, even in the 1980s, I feel can ill afford that sort of sense of security. We are not secure. We are not secure in an economic sense. We are not secure in a political sense. I work in the justice system, and I can say we are not secure in the way that justice is meted out. For those reasons, Columbia, and I would say to the degree this attitude is creeping into the area surrounding Columbia, is a dangerous entity. Many of the persons I interviewed who sent children through the Howard County school system commented on these various things, commented on very negative experiences that their children had as they attempted to matriculate through the school system. And I guess you read recently where we had an outcry about a black student achievement program. The fact that blacks still feel the need, even in a Columbia or a Howard County, to have a program uniquely geared towards the achievement of blacks lets you know that there are blacks who recognize that the traditional education and being raised in a safe environment is perhaps not enough to prepare a black child for life, and for, as many people still refer to it, the real world. It's just not enough.
Is there a possibility that with this sort of false sense of security that Columbia sort of may give young people the impression of, does possibility exist then that young blacks could grow up in a seemingly well desegregated community, feel comfortable about it, and then move elsewhere and all of a sudden get something different and not understand why?
That's very true. In fact, that was one of our motivations for the Black History Project. We felt it was very important that blacks in this county understand what this county was about previously, even as we struggle to evolve into a better county, as we all work together to make it into a better county, and one that's receptive and accepting of all of us. But I think you hit the nail on the head. I feel there is a real danger in not being aware of the background and of the events that have transpired along the way, particularly when one ventures out into some less receptive environments. It's just there's always a danger of your first time is usually your worst time, and there's just always a danger when you have no preparation, no background, no knowledge, no learning about how to react appropriately to a negative situation. I mean, no one wants to teach negatives, but on the other hand, let's face it, the world, you have to a great degree, you have to take the world as you see it, and there's a danger in any false sense of what the world is about, and your unique, and a danger in you forgetting or making a mistake about what your world is truly about.
So what then is it, what is the lesson that we need to teach our youth, whether they stay here or leave here?
The lesson I would teach our youth is that, unfortunately, even in the 1980s, there's a great deal of racial discrimination, and by that I mean overt racial discrimination being practiced in job environments, in the service sectors, etc. And I would want young people to learn how to positively combat that sort of overt racism. I would also want young blacks to be aware of subtle negative racial attitudes that are held by too many people that we have to encounter and that we have to relate to as we go through. I simply want them to be aware and, again, develop the tools, hopefully from their parents, and if not from other institutions in their environment, develop the tools to overcome it and not be shaken by it, not be terrorized by it, not be shocked by it.
All right, let's talk about some of the sort of four main issue areas: fair housing, political participation, education, and employment opportunities. Fair housing. Let's talk about housing in general in Howard County. What has been some of the what was the past issue? The Fells Lane issue comes up a lot. What was that all about? Can you tell me about the Fells Lane housing?
Well, Fells Lane was about, as I recall, approximately 60 families living in substandard conditions. The conditions were unsanitary, unsafe, and just generally subpar in terms of particularly any modern day housing code. And unfortunately, it impacted on blacks, and therefore it was black people and forming a coalition with whites and other interested persons who saw fit to challenge those conditions and have them removed. The result was the Hilltop Housing Project.
And now, was that one of the first instances of federal subsidy in Howard County?
That was as far as we were able to document the very first instance of using federal funds to cure a substandard housing condition.
I see. Okay. What impact did the growth of Columbia have on the issue of housing for blacks?
The major impact was the fact that educated and concerned blacks in greater numbers than had ever resided in this community before came here. And once you had a good number of educated and concerned persons, then you could have a group large enough and effective enough in its advocacy to bring about a change. And I do believe that's the sort of quick and organized reaction that you had to that sort of problem has been repeated throughout the history of Columbia and Howard County over these past 2 decades.
We digress just a little bit away from housing, but in a general sense, why did blacks believe James Rouse? Why did they believe that what he was saying was going to actually happen?
Well, I suppose it had a lot to do with the climate of the late 60s and 70s. I believe his timing was perfect, putting the formation of Columbia against the backdrop of where the civil rights movement had come at the point Columbia was proposed was a reason. We were coming from the Kennedy era and into the Johnson years. I simply believe the national political climate was such that a concept such as open housing would be attractive and believable against the backdrop of that sort of essential legislation.
Now, was it such that James Rouse came in and said, hey folks, this is how it's going to be. It's going to be an open door policy, and everybody said, gee, that's great, Jim. We're going to do it just like you say? Or were there some sort of modifications that people found that they needed to make within his original views?
Well, to my mind, there were no changes made as to his original views. Now, when they got around to the actual implementation, you had people to come in who were not 100% in agreement with his policies and practices, and one of the ones that sticks out most to me, and that was brought to my attention by any number of people, were that in the early days we had realtors to actually come out in building the very first communities to steer blacks away from certain communities. Here you are with a brand new town, only 4 or 5 houses up, and already you had people, immediately you had realtors to come out and determine, you don't really want to begin to say, you don't really want to buy here, you want to buy over there. Of course, the way I understand it, it was quickly, once brought to the surface, it was quickly stopped. But that's the sort of example of the kind of person who obviously either had not read the literature or didn't understand what it meant and came out to do it the way it must have been done wherever he or she came from. But it certainly was not going to be done that way here.
I was unaware that happened. Okay, getting back to the issues again. Let's talk about political participation. Again, what was the well, where have we come in terms of black political participation? Where has this county come from? Where does it look like it is now? And where is it probably going to go in the future?
Well, we came from, as I mentioned earlier, no black elected officials. As I recall, Fred Weaver was early on appointed to a what was in the old days called a personnel board. However, he was not. That was not an elective post. In 1982, he more or less had a banner year because we got Dr. C. Vernon Gray elected to the county council on a county-wide basis. Also, Bill Manning a black came onto the school board, and in addition, we had 2 black women to be elected to the Central Democratic Committee. So that was a banner year. Unfortunately, I can't say that our numbers have really increased. Of course, we had a major change in our county council elections going into the district procedure as opposed to the at-large elections we had in the past. But so far, the persons who've been elected have been able to be re-elected so far. But that's the degree of documented progress. However, we do have a good degree of participation on the various local boards, the community boards that run the village boards, the boards that run the city. We have blacks very active in the Columbia Association, and just throughout. And I would say that we've done quite well in terms of accepting positions and getting seats and places on the governing bodies of the county.
I believe, from most of the people I've spoken with, it seems that that the blacks in this county were, at least in the past, pretty much heavily on the registered as Republicans, and all the people I've talked to were registered Republicans. Now it seems to be very heavily that they're registered Democratic. I wonder if, and it seems that it sort of Columbia is the Democratic center of the black Democrats, and the rest of the county, everybody still seems to be Republican. That's what I'm finding. Do you know this to be true as well? Or do you
Well, I've never really looked into that fact. However, I can tell you that in the history of blacks in general, the Republicans was originally our party of choice. I mean, from the days of Abraham Lincoln, and that prevailed for a good long time. So maybe that's some barometer of one segment of the community not having come into the 60s, so to speak, and moved on into the 80s, whereby Colombians are a good deal more trendy and probably follow the national trends a little bit more closely than the rural portions of the county. It's the most I could guess at.
That's the way it seems to me. What has the political success of Dr. Vernon Gray meant for blacks politically here in Howard County?
It's been marvelous. You cannot quantify or calculate what it means to black people to have a positive role model, particularly for black children, who I think I can safely say are our future. It's meant, on that scale alone, it's just immeasurable in terms of value and worth. Now, however, it's also good to have someone who's open and accessible as we meet the kinds of as we meet problems in our day-to-day existence here in the county. Dr. Vernon Gray is very supportive of the traditional lower income classes, senior citizens, and other people who would perhaps not otherwise have as strong a voice on the county council. And blacks also are aware of the fact that he is simply generally supportive of our concerns. Of course, that's not, all problems are not dealt with or capable of resolution at the county council level. But it's been my experience, and I think I could fairly speak for blacks in this community, that it's been our experience that where there has been a need and a situation where Dr. Gray could positively intervene, he has.
All right, let's talk about education. Again, trying to sort of make a different point about sort of Columbia, pre-Columbia, and post-Columbia. Instead of putting it in those terms, and put it in terms of I guess maybe the terms it comes down to being is pre-desegregation and post-desegregation. I don't know, but what has in 1964 when schools were integrated? What did that mean for the black population? Was that good? Was that bad? Because I know there's a whole. For instance, this is what I'm getting at. The community in the Guilford area and whatnot loved Harriet Tubman High School so much. And when desegregation came about, it actually came about. It seems like there's a paradox because it came about with mixed feelings. And you'd think, isn't that something you want? Well, yeah, desegregation is something we want, but look what's going to happen to the things that we as blacks take pride in our community. It's going to get dissolved. Or what they really feared was that our good teachers will be taken away and put in the white schools, and we'll get all the bad white teachers, and you'll call that integration. And that's what we'll get left with, because it'll still be our community high school, but we'll get the dregs from the rest of the county dumped on us. That seems to have been a fear. A lot of good things happened to a lot of graduates from Tubman High School as a segregated school. So what then are the relative merits of the desegregation of county schools and the impact on education for us all, not just for blacks, but for us all?
Okay, well, your fears were the fears you express are certainly often heard and often recounted. What I'm trying to remember how I believe it was Jean Toomer, how she put it. What you had to happen is not so much integration as desegregation. And there is a difference. In other words, what we had was desegregation, meaning both races began to attend the same institution. And that means the school is desegregated. In other words, you no longer have separate schools. But integration meant a great deal, and that is what we fear. That's where the mixed question comes in. Do you really want to integrate? Because to some blacks, integration means assimilation or loss of what we always considered very positive things. It's very positive to have a black high school with a very strong black principal of the caliber of a Dr. Silas Craft, excellent teachers, concerned teachers of the nature of an L. Hart, Carter Woodson. Those models and those types of figures one would never want to lose. And therefore the fear in so-called integration is that one will assimilate, thereby losing those sorts of role models, the sort of comfort factor that comes when you are going, the whole neighborhood school concept, I mean, which was traditionally a banner cry of white persons who opposed integration, but quiet as it's kept, there are a number of blacks who recognize the validity and the positive points of children attending schools with children who they know, with children whose parents they know. It simply fosters the whole community concept, and no one's about destroying. We recognize communities to be a good thing, and nobody was about destroying communities. And so the problem with and then let's look at integration another way. In addition to the fear and the problems you have, if you assimilate, that is, if you come into an environment and your goal becomes to mix, to blend. I mean, it's the old, it kind of flows from the old melting pot theory. I mean, some may be for it. I'm personally not sure how I feel about that. I'm not so sure I want to melt as I want to be. And for those persons who hold that view, again, the whole notion of integration is simply, has not worked out 100% positively. In the same sense, another problem with integration is, again, I think the main one, though, is the fact that you lose the control over what is a very major institution in the schools. You no longer have the number of black principals, and you no longer have that type of black principal, the one who took a hands-on and one-on-one and direct approach to dealing with black children. And that's not the person you attend, the principal you have now probably is not the same. It's not the person you attend church with, or bowl with. If it is, obviously you have a much stronger bond and a more deeply held concern for that child. You just don't have that kind. You don't have those kinds of bonds anymore. It's one of the byproducts of desegregation or integration, depending upon which term you want to use.
Let's talk about that a little. What is it that the black community here in Howard County would rather see? Integration or desegregation? Any reflections on that?
I doubt that many persons would want to go back to segregated schools, mainly because you didn't get the materials and the kind of focus and monetary support that you would, that white schools got. I mean, that was the whole, I believe that was the whole thrust towards, that's what was the impetus behind a desire to integrate the schools in the first place. What you lose again in that process is control over the institution. There are a lot of complaints about how teachers react to black children overall, and I have to say primarily white teachers who are who simply have not had any exposure to black children, and black children go into schools with the ideas and values and cultural background that they bring from their homes. And so the problem you have is with is the more or less the clash of cultures. And when you have that kind of clash of cultures, you don't always end up with the very best learning environment, because we spend too much time trying to figure one another out, or why it is that you speak that way, or why it is that you dress that way, or why you talk incessantly, and even conversational styles. I mean, and that simply detracts. But so I cannot say that we really would be that blacks overall would oppose or have ever opposed desegregation or integration, whichever one of those terms you're using. It's just that there's a need for improvement. You need black administrators to see that the process is, or that all the processes are fair, be they testing, be they promotion of teachers within the ranks, be they the handing out of awards, both teachers and pupils. You simply must have that. You must have blacks as coaches, as leaders. That's what the constant monitoring and the cry is at this point for, again, integration across the board, not only in the class, I mean, not only in who sits in the seats, but in who dictates the policies, so that you can be assured of a fair process, so that you can be assured that this cultural clash doesn't result in someone being left on the wayside simply because of a lack of understanding or communication.
Let's talk about that cultural clash a little more and try to extrapolate where we think that may be heading. Does it look that as a community here we're heading for a sort of that the whites are assimilating black culture and the blacks are assimilating white culture and becoming sort of more the same, and being able to then get along, for lack of a better term, with each other because of that process? Or is that not happening? What's your...
I believe it is happening as far as I can observe. I'm not, of course, involved in the school system per se, so all my observations are secondhand. But as far as I can see, it looks as if the children get along fairly well. I know you have a good deal of interracial dating. You have the mixed athletic clubs, and all the, from what I can see, all of the various groups and clubs in the schools are integrated. I'm also noting, however, the existence of Afro-American clubs or Black History clubs, because again, there still seems to be the need for and the desire for instruction in the area of Black history and Afro-American culture, mainly because the curriculum, the traditional curriculum, has always been viewed as deficient, and I do believe it's still deficient in that area. In other words, the only way you really instruct on Afro-American culture and Black history is to do it through some sort of club or organization, because the traditional curriculum doesn't touch on it adequately. As far as I can see, the children do quite well and do emulate one another. I hope in a positive sense. I hope they're picking up from one another the best of each and not the worst of each.
I've often wondered if, like Alice says, you know, black children are black 12 months out of the year, not just in February. And it seems to me, because I'm a historian myself, and it seems to me history is history 12 months out of the year, not just 1 month a year. And the black history, if you will, of the United States is part of U.S. history 12 months out of the year. Isn't really the goal of drawing attention, totally personal opinion, isn't really the goal of drawing attention to Afro-American history as such is to draw to attention so much so that it becomes so much a natural part of our knowledge of history in general that it actually makes itself as a separate entity obsolete in the future, so that we deal with it 12 months out of a year instead of just 1 month out of the year? Yes or no?
I think it's a goal to a degree, but never to the degree. I agree with you in part. You would never want Afro-American history to be integrated into what's normally taught as Western civilization. You see, blacks, though we have a portion of our history is endemic to the United States. I mean, we have the colonial era and coming forward. You simply, our history is much more vast than that. And so when you teach so-called Western civilization, I believe it's important to highlight minority participation in that Westernization. And if you're talking U.S. history, of course, it's very important to show what blacks did in creating and making the United States what it is today. However, our history is a lot broader and deeper than that. And if you focus on, and even when you get to the point where everyone will be able to know the accomplishments of Benjamin Banneker to the same degree as they know the accomplishments of Abraham Lincoln, you'll still need to know more about Egypt and Zaire and Jamaica and Barbados and even some South American countries that are so intertwined with Africa until it's incredible. It just runs much deeper and it's much too broad a subject, I feel, to ever be fully incorporated and more or less incorporated into simply what, again, I believe is most commonly thought of as the history of Western civilization, in the same sense that Chinese history we have many Chinese Americans also, but that history cannot be blended and meshed into U.S. history, because what they have contributed to the U.S. is, you could almost say, relatively small in terms of their contribution to the world overall. The same for Africans.
Yeah, sound analysis. All right. Let's see. Where was I? Okay. Let's move on to employment. It seems that for most blacks here in Howard County, again, pre-Columbia, everything always seems to be structured into pre-Columbia and post-Columbia when you talk about this county. Employment opportunities for blacks seem to be, I guess, maybe perhaps limited in one way. And maybe in post-Columbia, I don't know, they're limited in another way, or it's broadened somewhat, or what. In general, give me a past and present analysis of employment opportunities in Howard County for the black community.
Well, you know, that's a fairly difficult question, and I tell you why. It's because the vast majority of black Americans in this county work outside of this county, in the same sense that the majority of persons, period, work outside of this county. At least that was true the last check I made. It's hard to think of a major, I mean, I understand that General Electric is the major private sector employer here, and I would venture that Howard County government is the largest public sector employer. I don't know a great deal about General Electric. I can say this about Howard County government, however. I believe it is doing more and better than it did in the past, and that impression is based upon numbers, sheer numbers. I believe a great deal more could be done and must be done in terms of the levels of employment. In other words, the blacks truly have not penetrated the upper echelons of Howard County government nearly to the degree they should, given, again, the caliber in the sense of educational level, experience and background, the caliber of black persons that you have here. I just don't believe the government appears to be very, that blacks appear to be very well represented in the ranks of government. And then you get into your service industries that are hiring almost minute numbers, but they're hiring minute, but that's because they have minute working staffs. It simply doesn't, Columbia has a good number of ma and pa establishments, and it just doesn't take a large number of persons to run them. But you look at a large employer, such as a Heck Company or a Woody's, a relatively large employer, and it on its face it looks like everything's okay. But you really have to go into that company's or that entity's individual file and do your statistical analysis before you can really say, and I'm just not prepared to comment much further than that.
How have white attitudes changed toward the black community?
Well, that's a fairly tough one too, because I can't say that they have changed much. I believe Columbia brought to it or attracted to it a representative sample of attitudes. And unfortunately, in addition to those who came seeking a mix or an integrated community and and housing that was not, this block is a black block and that's a white block, people who did not want to live in those kinds of inner city housing patterns. In addition to bringing that sort of person, unfortunately, I think it brought people who would just as well not have a black neighbor, but a person who would make an economic choice, who would simply look around the Washington, Baltimore metropolitan area or this corridor and say, well, Columbia is where I really need to be. It's close to my, it's close to my job. It's got good schools, and most importantly, my housing will appreciate at a faster clip than it will if I purchase in, say, Baltimore County. I really believe that. And given that the person who made his or her choices based upon those factors, and some are neutral or don't care whether the neighbor is black, but I honestly feel there are those who came and would just as well not have their neighbor be black, but just say I'll simply have to accept it to get out of it these things that work to the advantage of myself and my family. So I think you attracted persons with all sorts of attitudes, and I believe you continue to attract persons with all attitudes across the board, and I believe we sort of peacefully coexist here. Fortunately for our community, I believe it's still must be classified as overall liberal, whatever that means in 1988. I think we qualify, and given that, fortunately for blacks and for progressive whites as well, that kind of behavior will simply not be tolerated, and is frowned upon and looked down upon to such a degree that it will rarely be overt. I changed the never because we just had the Turf Valley incident, but you will rarely have overt racial epithets and overt cross actions such as cross burnings, et cetera, particularly in the Columbia community. There are not a lot of persons who of course will stand in the face of a unreceptive public and do things in a public manner. And most of us like acceptance and getting along and going along, and because it's not acceptable and because you will be come down on. I believe we more or less, we meaning the liberal element of this community, has the upper hand.
So you see it more as an overbearing economic factor that helps us or almost forces us all to get along better because we live in a nice economic spot between Baltimore and Washington that makes it more acceptable for us all to get along together.
Absolutely. I believe we all recognize our common interest in again, the very factors that brought us here: safe, clean, and relatively crime-free system, environment, along with a good educational system. That means that, and along with, and most of us enjoy, we don't like the parking at the library, but we certainly enjoy the reading material, and we certainly, I mean, we like the intellectual environment of Columbia.
Now, is that to say that nobody really moved here with the maybe sort of pie in the eye or whatever kind of pie in the eye, pie in the sky?
Sky, I think it is.
Thank you. Yeah, if you're pie-eyed, that means something entirely different. The pie in the sky thought of, wow, I'm going to move to Columbia because we're all going to be brothers and we're all going to coexist. I mean, is that to say nobody?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that, fortunately, because I don't believe we would be where we are, fortunately, Columbia did attract a good number of both blacks and whites who seriously and whose number one reason for coming to this community was the fact that there would be open housing, and what open housing translates to is mixed race environment, both housing-wise, school-wise, you name it. I was only commenting upon the fact that among the white population, I believe you had, and that you continue to have, people who elect to live here on pure economic reasons and on the comfort factors that have absolutely nothing to do with whether it's mixed or whether we ever get an Asian or attract many more Indians. People who really don't care. And then, unfortunately, along with that, you have people who are overtly opposed, but who will swallow that objection because, let's face it, I think we have one of the nicer pieces of the rock, so to speak. And there are people who will, as you know, people will swallow and overcome almost any objection to get to, particularly in this Wall Street, I'm commenting on the movie, and with that kind of mindset and orientation towards financial advantage, you'll have people who, again, people will swallow a prejudice if to deal with to get their pocketbook to where they want their pocketbook to be. It's just less important.
Is there a legitimate way of helping to break down prejudices?
Is what a legitimate?
By sort of forcing people into an economic situation where they're forced to swallow them, as you say. And then they just sort of, they're there for so long they've become used to being acceptive to everyone else. And they sort of, oh yeah, I used to be prejudiced. I've sort of forgot about it now because they've been here for so long. They've been acclimated to the society for so long. Is that a legitimate way of getting rid of prejudice? Well,
my understanding is that the sociologists and psychologists, I believe, would concur that you do change attitudes by changing behavior. And again, so insofar as you make people talk certain ways and walk certain ways and relate to certain people, ultimately their attitudes follow. So first you change the behavior, and somehow the heart and mind follows it. And so though you may not pitch it exactly the way you put it, I mean, you don't hang on the sign, guess what, if you live next to this person for 3 years, you may actually grow to like them. I believe that's precisely what goes on. At first they thought they didn't like you, and then they just ultimately kept seeing, you crossed so many times, and it became okay.
Yeah, that definitely seems to happen here. 15 left? I'm 50 in? Oh, okay, thanks. All right, let me ask you basically two questions left. Very simply, have blacks made progress here in this county?
Yes. How?
That's it. To what extent?
Well, again, on the political scene, I definitely think we're faring relatively well there. I'd also say in education, because we are doing better achievement-wise on your traditional measures of achievement. Blacks are doing better. We also have better representation at the administrative level in the school systems. That is more input into policy and the kinds of things that we know are necessary to running a good school system. Economically, it's hard to say that we've progressed. The most I can say is that we seem to be doing at least as well as everyone else. I mean, you're not seeing any change in the racial composition of Howard County. In other words, blacks aren't, there are not fewer blacks, and those of us who are here seem to be surviving well, doing more than surviving, faring well in a middle class sense. So I can't say, I certainly would say there's progress. I believe those are the major indicators of how well you're doing.
What's left to do?
What's left to do is to progress more, to not become complacent again when you have one county councilman, but to say this isn't a quota system after all. As many people as are qualified and capable should hold seats. To look at something like your judiciary and say, you know, when are we going to penetrate the judgeships in the county? To look at, we had a problem with the office of the clerk in terms of racial composition. And I don't want to pick on anyone in particular, because there are many sectors where there's a need for some black representation. So that's how I would define the progress. Again, you need to continue to do blacks need to continue to do the best they can do wherever they are to penetrate sectors where they haven't penetrated. And when I say to do the best you can do, that means that if we're doing our very best, we will have greater representation than currently. And that means our achievements, if we're talking to the children, that means that the achievement scores will continue to go up in this integrated and quality school system. And also, of course, we are constantly monitoring and being on guard against racially prejudiced attitudes wherever they are expressed, and that's something we will always have to do.
Last question, very briefly. Why did you participate in the writing of this oral history of Black Howard County?
I participated because I felt it was extremely important for blacks to know where they came from, what this county was like before Columbia, and also, given that we're 20 years into the Columbia experiment, what Columbia was about from the very beginning. Is simply very important to know what has happened, so that insofar as it's negative, you can prevent it from happening again, and insofar as it's positive, you can replicate it. Important to know.
You don't think we made it?
I think the tape ran out.
Okay, that was my last question. Hang loose just 1 second, let me check that tape.